Hey kiddies, it's Triple Feature Tuesday once again, and this week we're going to be looking at these guys versus vampires. That's right, it's Thanksgiving this week, and what makes you think of Thanksgiving more than vampires? Or more specifically, movies that have no real plot outside of it's this guy versus a ton of vampires, and that's the draw of the movie for various different reasons. Sometimes it's the greatness of the acting, or other times it's just this is the craziest idea ever. I can't believe you got somebody to put up money for this. So let's see what we got. Our menu is going to include The Last Man on Earth, John Carpenter's Vampires, and Tales from the Crypt presents Bordello of Blood. Last Man on Earth is the first of three feature film adaptations of Richard Matheson's classic I Am Legend, in which we follow the foibles of the last human being on Earth in a world overrun by vampires. Last Man on Earth is essentially Vincent Price versus a world overrun by vampires, and is to date the most faithful adaptation of Richard Matheson's novel, the other two being Charlton Heston in Omega Men and Will Smith in I Am Legend. This version is essentially Castaway, but with vampires, and instead of Tom Hanks, it's Vincent Price. And this would make it fascinating in and of itself, because this was Vincent Price in the 50s, so he's at the height of his powers before he, I mean, it's not his fault that he became such a camp figure, but, he became a camp figure. But before then, he was Vincent Price, and he was just brilliant and great. That's putting it wrong. He was always Vincent Price, and he was always great, but he used to be, you were able to suspend disbelief for a serious plot, and this one is just this poor guy who's the only one immune to a disease that turned everybody into vampires. Now, they're called vampires in the movie. The book, they actually are vampires. In this version, they're sort of more zombie than not, or, since we're keeping it vampires, let's consider them ghouls, shambling undead that have very little willpower on their own, but they're called vampires, so we're going to pretend they're vampires. And it's really, really neat. I caught it on TCM one night and was very impressed by how creepy it actually is. Part of this being it was filmed entirely in Italy for money reasons, and so you get these really stark shots of cities in Italy with, everything broken down or dead bodies lying around, and poor Vincent Price is scrounging around for everything, and then he of course gets overrun by not just the regular vampires, but the vampires that are trying to, rebuild society, and it's just a shame. But it's neat because Vincent Price, when the world at large still considered him a serious actor, fighting vampires for pretty much an entire movie. Next up, we have the, not necessarily more comedic, but definitely taking itself less seriously, John Carpenter's Vampires. There is a plot, but really the plot is subordinate to James Woods Fights Vampires, which that was the reason I watched it. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed John Carpenter movies at the time, but I hadn't really given myself over to the cult of John Carpenter. And, I mean, if we're being honest, this is not the strongest entry in his work, but it's still very distinctly a John Carpenter movie. You just see similar sort of themes and shots and composition, but throughout all of it is James Woods, who honestly can do anything, but had never really fought monsters like that before, because usually he's a bad guy, but this time he's more of an anti-hero, playing Vatican-backed Jack Crow vampire hunter with his sidekick Daniel Baldwin and priest Tim Guinea, which makes the whole movie kind of fun. And if you read some of the production stuff, John Carpenter had nothing but good things to say about James Woods once they figured out how to do it, which is James would give John Carpenter one or two takes as scripted, and then he would let James Woods do whatever the hell he wanted for another couple of takes, and more often than not, those are the takes that ended up in the movie, because James Woods has a great improvisational ad-libbing instinct, and that's what you want when you have this guy fighting a ridiculous amount of vampires. They are full-on vampires, but they're in the West, which is just weird. I covered this movie before with the Western Vampires triple feature with Near Dark and The Forsaken. But there are a lot of good monster effects, a lot of good just general effects, and just James Woods being more badass than I ever gave him credit for, because it just never really presented it before, but it's really fun, and the vampires are vampires. There's no sparkly. They are gothed out, but they're also really just very feral and monster-like, which just adds to everything. And just the movie, I think, well, I love it because of this. I think it sort of suffers from it being neither fish nor fowl. It's like a Western movie where instead of black hats, you have vampires, and so it's just sort of strange. But John Carpenter just comes up with strange ideas all the time and makes them brilliant, which this one, not necessarily brilliant, still interesting, whereas I think like with a lesser director it would have been very boring, or with a lesser leading man. Finally, we have Tales from the Crypt presents Bordello of Blood, which is simply Dennis Miller fighting vampires for 90 minutes. This was the second part in an intended Tales from the Crypt trilogy, starting with Demon Knight, and then eventually they did make the third movie. It was called Ritual, which they released as not a Tales from the Crypt movie because Bordello of Blood bombed very badly. But then later on DVD they repackaged it to be the third movie, but it doesn't really matter because nobody ever saw it. This one, honest to God, there is like some plot, but it's really just Dennis Miller fighting vampires in all his Dennis Milleriness. This was back in the 90s before he sort of, embraced his inner conservative. So he was still, you can still root for him and feel good about yourself. A lot of just random references to things you've never heard about, and just more snark than anybody this side of Lewis Black, which just is fun when the guy is also, driving stakes through vampires' hearts. And oh, what vampires! This movie is sort of cut from the same cloth of From Dusk Till Dawn, in which it is a brothel run out of a mortuary where all these scantily clad prostitutes are also vampires, led by Angie Everhart, and I thought she did a good job. Other people of note, Corey Feldman gets to be a vampire, which is delightful. His older sister is Erica Eleniak. She's sort of wasted in this movie. It's a shame. But on the opposite end, you get Chris Sarandon playing an evangelical preacher, like one of those TV evangelists, which is just really a lot of fun because more Chris Sarandon doing accents is just always a good time. As was Dennis Miller. He served his purpose. The movie served its purpose. I like it. But I'm already in the bag for just about everything Tales from the Crypt does. So This Guy versus Vampires, starring Vincent Price in The Last Man on Earth, James Woods in John Carpenter's Vampires, and Dennis Miller in Bordello of Blood. And I may or may not see you guys next week. It's going to be a crazy weekend. I hope everybody has a good Thanksgiving, and I will see you soon.